And hello and welcome to Mary, Cliona and Ger. It's great to be part of this important debate. Mary, if I can come to you first, how can the Federation of Irish Sport and the national governing bodies of sport encourage companies and brands to develop a policy on equality, diversity and inclusion when they come into the sports marketplace? Is it something that needs to be driven at a sports administration level?
The first things I would say to that is that we need to learn from the past. In the past, national governing bodies would have more or less pleaded for mainstream media to give coverage of their sport to entice sponsors and brands and so on. And subsequently, sponsors and brands would have looked for, better performances, more attendances, and so on. And then to complete the circle, you had media looking for better stories. So we need to learn from that. We also need to move away from the argument of comparing men's and women's sport. For me, that's a mute argument. It's a conversation that just should not happen anymore. That's an old narrative. What I think we need to concentrate on is national governing bodies looking internally what their unique selling point is for their women's sport, and then obviously targeting brands and commercial entities that suit their strategic objectives when it comes to women in sport. So, if you're getting money into your organisation for women and girls sport, it's not just about getting the money in anymore. It's about what do you want the outputs to be by that investment. Do you want to try and grow your membership base, increase your coverage, target new audiences, and so on. So all that is really, really important. The one thing I would say, COVID-19 is obviously having a huge impact on us all, and it's going to have a huge impact on the external environment in Ireland, and that's going to affect brands and commerce alike. So, we need to see that as an opportunity for women's sport, because traditionally entry into sponsorship of women's sports would be a low entry point. So there's an opportunity for women's sport to make the best of this now, and to seek out sponsorship and then demonstrate, once you get the sponsors in, the huge return on investment that you get from sponsoring women's sport. And if you can do that, I believe that there will be a sustainable change. But it's not easy, because if it was easy, it would have been done previously. At a localised level and a regional level and a national level is really going to stand to women's sports, because more and more people are having the access now to actually at the click of a button to see women's sport live, and that's what we need.
So plenty of opportunities in the commercial sphere there. And if I can come in terms of editorial policy around gender balance in reporting, where do we start with measurement and target setting to find out where we stand and if we're improving? How can we find out who's done this and what supports are out there?
Back in 2013, I suppose we started focusing on women's sports coverage. And it was really thanks to the Irish women's rugby team when they went over to Italy, and we sent an OB over there to cover that match. And there was massive support for that team, and there was real interest in it. And also we showed the Women's FAI Cup final that year as well. But it really wasn't until we joined as media partners with 2020 that we looked at the area of measurement and targets. And our DG, D Forbes, said rather than increase by 20%, that we would be 20% by 2020, which is very ambitious when you look at, I suppose the sports media landscape is very male dominated, and coverage in general, as Sarah outlined earlier, is very, very low in all platforms. But so what we did was we set up a steering group within RTE. We created our very first women in sports strategy, and we broke it down into 4 pillars, which is content, presenters, pundits and outreach. And what we did was we engaged with SVT over in Sweden. They're a public service broadcaster over there, and they started a measurement system a number of years ago, and they started with 25, they went up to 40, and now they're actually at 50-50. And I know that we can look to the Swedes and Scandinavian countries and say they're so far ahead of us in every way, but in actual fact, the World Economic Forum has Ireland as 7th in the gender in terms of gender equality in society. So what we did was we broke down the content area, and we said, well, for television we should be 20%. And I suppose this year, Mary just mentioned that their COVID hit, and as a result of that, we didn't have the Olympics and the Paralympics coverage, which would have been 50-50 coverage for over 300 hours of our output. So we're currently at 14%. and we will aim to be 25% actually for next year. But the reason I say that targets are so important is that then we looked at our broadcast schedule, and we looked at what sport we could put in place there, and we did 39 hours of sports classics. And what we would have done in the past was we would have just looked at the 60s, 70s and 80s and picked the best matches from then. But we looked at it with a gender lens as a result of our targets. And so as a result, we did 39 hours, and 38% of the programs that we made had women's sports in it. Also, another factor is that I think that if you don't measure, and we found this with a lot of the European broadcasters as well, that you think that you're far better and you're doing than you actually are. And that I was doing ad hoc measurements on television, and what I had presumed was that horse racing would have been 33%, but in actual fact, when we started to measure our horse racing coverage, it actually was closer to 8.5, 8.7% when you look at female jockeys and female trainers as well. And so, and then once you know where you are, then you can address it. And so we spoke to a CEO of one of the race courses, and he said what they do an awful lot of the time is they put on women-only races. And what he said to do is that he'd start to schedule those in our broadcasts. So you can start to really make a change from that. The business case around it is well made. Like SVT grew their website 100% when they started to do women's sports stories. But I suppose the big challenges around that is you have to resource it yourself. So, Mary mentioned this earlier, collaboration between all stakeholders in sport, like between brands, media and federations is so important. Like for us, if we're going to put investment into covering an OB, then we would want that a match to be on in prime time, where the biggest possible audience. And so federations have to look at that. When we're looking at facilities, we need the women's sports matches to be on in rural settings, which is often the case, and you can't get broadband out of it, or you have to build scaffolding. And then, as well as that, I suppose what you have is, the wires are full of international men's sports stories. So to go and find women's sports stories, you need investment. And so we need federations as well to look at their marketing and their spend and their communication spend, and maybe weight it more for the women's sports than for the men's sports, where, an awful lot of media already know exactly what's happening there. So, and brands as well, I think, like Liberty and AIB and others have come in and helped us and invest in OBs as well. So, so the whole ecosystem, I think, coming together would pave a way forward for women's sport.
Yeah, interesting stuff. And actually, Ger, maybe you'd pick up on that idea. I do want to ask you actually how we encourage more female reporters and journalists into the industry. But initially, how have On the Ball gone about measuring the gender balance in your reporting?
I think from our perspective, it was pretty clear that we were coming off a low base. Like most of the media organizations around the world who were covering sport, we would have been completely dominated by the big sports stories of the day. I think back to before this whole campaign started, and we would have covered Manchester United, we would have covered Liverpool in the Premier League, and the Dublin football team, the Kerry football team, the Kilkenny Hurlers, or whoever it was, and we would have covered women's sports at key moments. So the icons of women's sport would have been covered, the big names and feature interviews and the history of women's sport we would have done great pieces on. But it was the everyday stuff that wasn't getting covered, and that probably wasn't part of the conversation. So the easiest way for us to measure this on the other side without having a sophisticated measuring system like they have in Sweden, and now it's great to hear that we have the national broadcaster here as well, is to just insist that we have women on every day talking about women's sports. And that's the easiest measurement from our perspective. And I think it actually it is very closely related to the other issue, which was creating, from our perspective, what we really needed to do was create a pathway for people to enter the sports media industry that wasn't a barrier, so that young women who were interested in sport and coming through, most of our staff, we have actually got through the third level system here on work experience. That's been the traditional route for people to come and join Off the Ball in basically since 2002, since we started as a radio show. And we found increasingly that there were fewer and fewer women applying for our internships. And then when we did actually have jobs to advertise, when we launched OTB as a standalone company 4 years ago, We put up 2 jobs for digital journalists, and I would say we had 60 applicants, and 2 of them were female. And that was obviously partly to do with us, and it turns out the language we were using to advertise those roles, but also because I think young women didn't feel like this was an environment for them where they were going to have opportunities. There wasn't role models, and talking to the third level institutions, it certainly seemed like there was an issue there. As somebody who was looking for new young talent coming through, that's a very practical thing that we can do, is actually going and showcasing as an ecosystem. I think was the word that Cliona used there, that it's not just our organization doing it, that it was in conjunction with RTE and other media owners, but also with the NGBs, so that there's a community out there who are saying this is a viable career for you, it's an important career, and we need your voices, and there will be big opportunities for the best young female journalists coming through who are interested in sports and who want to work in this field.
Yes, I know from my own perspective, speaking to several women's sports media professionals, that the perception isn't always there. The understanding that it is actually a fantastic profession, and there are amazing opportunities there at the moment, and that's probably the messaging that needs to go out there. Harry, if I can come back to you at a sort of a nuts and bolts grassroots level, how can the Federation of Irish Sport and by extension the NGBs ensure that the development and promotion of girls and women in sport in comparison with boys and men is moving the bar to equality? I'm thinking as well of challenges including access to pitches, coaching facilities, etc.
Age-old question, age-old challenge. Change can be difficult, and what I mean by difficult is that to really instill meaningful change, you need to engage, and you need to communicate, and you need to educate. And what I mean by educate, I don't mean it in a patronising way. What I mean by educate is, to ensure that they understand, where women's sport is coming from, and also we need to understand what their challenges are. I think sports clubs can be a microcosm of society, and social change in larger society takes time. But for me, if that's still an argument in 2020, we need to take a look at ourselves. We need to start aiming higher, and we need to look at who are the decision makers, how are the decisions being made, what is the rationale for that decision. I think there's simple things that can be done at a localised level where policies can be created and agreed, that will outlive any agendas, personalities, or egos and so on. If you believe that you have a situation that is unfair, you need to make the case, frame the dialogue, frame the conversation, and I suppose what I'm trying to say is that you have a conversation that is, taking the gender out of it. And if they're saying that, well, look, we have more men and boys playing the sport, therefore we need more access to facilities, for example, you need to counter-argument that and say, well, how can women and girls sport participation grow if we have limited access to facilities? To give an example of when, the gender is removed and you get a sustainable change, just need to look at the game of golf. Both the GUI and the ILGU came together to form Golf Ireland, and it wasn't about what was right for men and women, it was about what was right for the game of golf and how will the game of golf benefit from them coming together. So, when you have more women and girls on committees and so on, it's factually proven that you get better decision making. When you have more women and girls involved in sports, it leads to a better club cohesion. And obviously, if you have more female coaches, you increase the number of members you have in your club. So I think it's really important that we need to take a very open view on this and kind of come from a point of view of understanding. But again, if you go back to the game of golf, it looked at what was important for the sport and how can the sport win. Can we make decisions to make sure that the sport is always a winner, and remove the conversation around gender, where one gender feels that in the decision-making process or in the change, one of them loses.
Yes, I know from my own point of view, in cycle racing, I've seen the at sports administration levels, when there's more integration and inclusion, that it benefits the sport as a whole, and of course, inevitably the women's side of the game as well. Cliona, if I could ask you, and it's another subject dear to my heart, how's the language around sport in the media changed in terms of gender since the beginning of 20 by 20? What's shifted in terms of editorial policy and RT around the use of language? And is the trend encouraging, or does more need to be done?
Yeah, like I think actually just it's very interesting what Mary said there, and just the BBC came out with a report in August just saying that on unconscious bias in sport. And actually, one line from it is, in a world where rules were originally made for and by men, change looks like disruption when in reality it's inclusion. And that this is the case for language. I think that sometimes our language in sport can be, they can be stereotypes within it, and it can be sometimes very difficult to identify it because it's a way of speaking and words that are used that maybe that you just get so used to it that you can't see what the meaning within it. Like for back in February in 2018, I went to a Women in Sport conference, and I heard a Finnish footballer ask the question, why is it always the national team and then the women's national team? And it was the very first time really that I ever thought of that. And I said it when I came home, and everyone immediately went, yeah, God, and we changed the way we were doing it. But that's gender marking, and it is something that where you can hear a female golfer, but it's a golfer, and we just have to be really, really careful. But I think once it's identified and there's awareness around it, then immediately everybody will rectify that. So I mean, because that is like basically saying that men is the norm and women is a deviation, and there's more value in men when you say that. And I know a lot of the federations are changing and calling it the Men's World Cup and the Women's World Cup, or else just the World Cup as well. So and when how female athletes are portrayed as well, can keep propagating stereotypical views of femininity and masculinity as well. There was a study. Cambridge University did a study in 2016 on the Olympics coverage, and what they found was that adjectives like beat, win, dominate, and battle were used, for men, and compete, participate, and strive were used for women. So ultimately appropriating stereotypical view that men are more competitive. And it's very subtle, but it's really powerful in reinforcing unconscious bias. The BBC, within that report that I mentioned earlier as well, they identified an issue with many female athletes as well being talked about in relation to other people, like mother of or wife of. And they also pointed out to the issue of the male gaze, that a lot of camera operators and directors and picture editors are men, and so all it takes is awareness really around just making sure that what you're putting in picture is the right image. So and Ger just mentioned earlier as well, one area that I think is really, really important, and that's the area around female voices and opinions. And that was one aspect that we put a measurement on, and we said, well, we should be 20% with female voices. Now, this is coming from a low base where back in 2018, you could say we weren't measuring, but we were probably 2-3% of women speaking about men's sport. And now our measurement so far on television is we're at 27%, and on radio we're at 17%. And next year we're promising 30% for television and 25% and 20% for radio. So I think it's really, really important. This is the qualitative side of things, and is the female voices and the language that we use, and just I think it's awareness around it that's hugely important, because once people are aware, then you can rectify it.
Yeah, Jerry, you might want to pick up on that point as well. Language is key, isn't it? And I also wanted to ask you about how we, in carving out a dedicated space for women in sport, are there challenges around integrating that visibility? Do you think it's crucial that it becomes seamless and not that women in sport is ghettoized?
Yeah, I think a couple of things around this are very important. Everybody needs to be awoken. That's the first part of it. Like, it's interesting to hear Cliona talking about going to that conference in Finland and then coming back. It's like that unconscious bias has slipped into everybody's discussion around sport, and it has slipped into I would say how producers and researchers have filled their shows and how presenters have spoken about it. But as soon as you have a conversation and point it out, that can change really radically quite quickly. And that's going to have a knock-on impact that we're going to see the benefits of in future years. But I think, make no mistake, we are taking women's sport out of a ghetto and trying to integrate it. And, you know, all of human history will tell you that's a very difficult process, that there are some people you lose along the way, and there is the discombobulated who don't want the change. And, you know, maybe we actually just need to annoy those people and move on. And actually the time for the dinosaurs is over. So the people giving out about seeing a woman talking about men's sport on TV, I think we just need to mute that conversation on social. You know, I think the debate around what happened at the weekend with Sham Massey and Sergio Aguero, equality is not letting Sergio Aguero do that to her because he does it to men. Equality is saying this is a woman in the workplace and she deserves to be respected. And anybody who doesn't really get that, I don't know if we should be spending that much time trying to win that argument with those people. We should be trying to build a better world for the people that we actually do want and as part of our audiences in the future. But coming out of the ghetto, like you know, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we had a women's in sport podcast, and we would have played a clip on the radio and pointed people back to the podcast. But we had to change. Like we you know, from apart from the business case, the right thing to do is to start covering these amazing sports and the amazing sports people who are doing things, and also to create opportunity for people who are interested in these sports to have their sport covered. But it is a process that takes time.
Totally, all of us in many ways. Finally, everyone, well, we're here to talk, I guess, about what's next for women in sport, and we're asking everyone to hashtag think it, ask it. So what's your big question? What is it that you want everyone to ask of sporting stakeholders? I'll go to you first, Mary.
I think what the 20 by 20 campaign has proven is that there's an appetite for change, and there's a change in view of women's sport in this country, our athletes and our team sports and so on. So what I would ask people watching today is, what can you personally do to be part of the change? I think it's really important that we all look internally and say, well, what can I do? And I think there's something that we can all do, be it, you know, encouraging at our localized level, our regional level, or national level. But I've said in the past that change is the responsibility of us all. And if women and girls sport is going to continually expand and grow and become part of a new norm, then it needs to happen at grassroots level. But that grassroots level begins with you watching. And I would really appeal to everybody here to spread the good word and spread the message, and to be part of that change, because we won't regret it.
Very much the same way as Mary. You know, I spoke at the sports assembly for the EBU just last week, and you know, I asked, like, my favorite chapter of 2020 was make a pledge. And I asked every one of them there to make a pledge to do something for women's sport. And I just, that, like, for me, I suppose that it helps enormously when you have more women attending the matches and more men attending the women's sports matches. And when, you know, like, what I would say is every one of us has a responsibility to try and make sure that sport is inclusive for all. And so what is it that we can do and what I would ask for, I suppose, being involved in the media is, you know, watch more, listen more, read more, you know, just the more, like, every click that you do on the website for women's sport is making sure that another women's sport story is going to be written. So likewise, every single person that, you know, like, get to your television screen at 5 o'clock on Friday and watch the Irish soccer team play the Ukraine. You know, that wasn't being covered next Friday, except that we paid the money to put an OB in there so that people, Irish people, can watch the Irish team have arguably the biggest game for Irish women's soccer. You know, so, and the more people who sit there and watch and support that team, the more that we can all argue within the media that we should be doing more as well. So I would just say, you know, everyone has a responsibility, and just, you know, pick something and do it.
Ger, the next big question, what's the next big frontier for women's sport?
I think this has been a great national awakening. That's the legacy of 20 by 20, is that this is now a conversation that brands are having, that media organizations are having, And the ESRI survey that came out when the start of lockdown happened and everybody was at home, the gender gap seemed to close between men and women doing exercise. So it turns out that we all actually are really interested collectively in sport, and that it's not just about men or women being interested. I really hope, though, that the government row in behind this, and that actually there's a fairly radical shift in policy in terms of investing. Title IX in America really worked. It was an explosion in the number of women participating in sport, and I think we need an Irish version of that, where if you're going to get any government money, you need to split it 50-50 between the men's and the women's game. And I think that something like that will be the next tipping point. We've seemed to have awoken enough in terms of fan bases, in terms of volunteers, and in terms of media. It's not finished, and I'm not saying it's a lot done, more to do, but certainly it seems to me that the next thing that this requires is a big stick from the government saying you're not getting any money unless you can prove that you're legitimately giving it 50-50 between the under 8 boys and the under 8 girls and the under 21 boys and the under 21 girls. It's great that we have a collective will to do something, and you can really see what happens when everybody works together. But ultimately, I think government policy should have something that locks in the fact that we believe in equality and we believe in diversity.
And a great message. So say all of us. Yeah, thanks to Ger, to Cliona, and to Mary, and back to you, Jackie.